America, once a land of boundless hope and opportunity, now lay in ruins. The outbreak of a mysterious virus had spread faster than anyone had anticipated, wiping out entire cities in a matter of weeks. The infected, now a ravenous horde of mindless, flesh-eating zombies, had overtaken the nation. The survivors, though few, clung to life in pockets of resistance, hiding in the shadows, avoiding the bloodthirsty monsters lurking around every corner. In a small, fortified town, a group of survivors, once strangers, had come together in an effort to survive. They had made it through countless near-death experiences, but now, a greater challenge awaited them. The undead had breached their last line of defense, and the town was no longer safe. Among the group was Sarah, a former nurse, who had lost her family to the outbreak but remained determined to keep the survivors alive. She had seen too many good people fall, and she wasn't about to let their sacrifice be in vain. Her practical, calm demeanor made her a leader in a world that had lost all semblance of normalcy. Then there was Marcus, an ex-soldier who had been haunted by the horrors of war long before the outbreak. His survival skills were unparalleled, and his hardened resolve made him the group's protector. But even his resolve was beginning to crack under the weight of constant loss. As night fell on the ruined town, the group huddled around a makeshift fire in the basement of an old hardware store. Their eyes were tired, their faces drawn with worry. They had made the decision to leave the town that night. The zombies had surrounded them, and there was no time to waste. The group needed to move, quickly, if they had any chance of survival. "How much time do we have?" Sarah asked, glancing over at Marcus as he studied the map of the area they had scavenged. The map was old and weathered, but it was all they had to go on. "Maybe a few hours at best," Marcus replied, his voice low and serious. "The zombies are closing in. We need to head west, to the mountains. It's our best shot." The others nodded in agreement, though none of them looked particularly hopeful. They had been on the move for months, always running, always fighting, and the endless struggle was beginning to take its toll. They had lost so much, too much, and yet, the fight was far from over. Their plan was simple: gather what supplies they could, move out in small groups to avoid detection, and make their way to the mountains. But nothing was ever that easy anymore. As they prepared to leave, a sound echoed through the store, the unmistakable groans and shuffling footsteps of the undead. The survivors froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The zombies had found them again. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. She motioned for the group to hide behind the shelves and crates. The last thing they needed was a fight. They couldn't afford to make any noise or draw attention. The group huddled together, their breaths shallow as they waited. The sound grew louder, closer. It was only a matter of time before the undead would discover their hiding place. Marcus peered through the gaps between the shelves, his eyes narrowing as he counted the number of zombies moving past. There were at least a dozen, maybe more. They had no way of knowing if more were coming. They had to move soon, or they would be trapped. "We wait for the right moment," Marcus said, his voice firm. "When they pass, we move quickly. No hesitation." It felt like an eternity, but finally, the sound of shuffling feet began to fade. The group exhaled in relief, but their respite was short-lived. The zombies were still out there, and their presence in the town meant one thing: the survivors weren't safe here anymore. As the last of the zombies moved past, Marcus gave the signal. They grabbed their supplies, water, weapons, food, and anything else they could carry, and crept silently out of their hiding spot. The store's back door creaked loudly as it opened, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world outside had frozen in time. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant groans of the undead. The survivors moved quickly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the outskirts of town. They had to get to the mountains, there was no other choice. As they crossed an alleyway, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It wasn't from the zombies, but from one of their own. The group spun around, only to see one of their members, a young man named Ben, being dragged into the darkness by a pair of infected. His screams were desperate, but there was nothing they could do. Ben was already gone. "Keep moving," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with anguish. The group hesitated for a moment, but they knew the truth. They couldn't save him now. With heavy hearts, they pressed on, their minds focused on survival. The night ahead would be long, and the journey even longer, but they had a goal in sight. The mountains were their only hope. If they could make it there, maybe, just maybe, they would have a chance to rebuild. But for now, all they could do was keep moving, keep fighting, and hope that they weren't the next to fall. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold light over the abandoned streets. The town, once full of life, now seemed like a ghostly memory of the past. Sarah led the way, her eyes scanning every corner and alley for signs of danger. The others followed closely behind, their movements slow and deliberate. They couldn't afford to be careless. Every step could bring them closer to death. "Stay quiet," Marcus whispered, his voice harsh but low. "We don't know how many of them are out there." They had made it out of the hardware store, but the real danger was just beginning. The streets were eerily silent, but Sarah knew better than to trust the calm. The undead were always lurking, waiting for a careless movement or sound to give them away. They reached the edge of town and paused for a moment to catch their breath. The distant hills beckoned them, the mountains offering a glimmer of hope, but there was still a long way to go. They had to cross a wide-open stretch of road before they could even think about getting to the cover of the forest on the other side. "We need to move fast," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Once we hit the road, we don't stop until we're across." "I agree," Marcus added. "There's no telling how long we have before the horde finds us." The group nodded in agreement, the weight of their situation settling heavily on their shoulders. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. But as they turned to face the open road ahead, a sound caught their attention. It was soft at first, a distant, rhythmic thumping. At first, they thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. And not just any footsteps. These were the shuffling, dragging steps of the infected. "Get down!" Marcus hissed, pulling them all into the shadows of a crumbling building. They crouched low, hearts pounding in their chests. From their hidden vantage point, they could see the silhouette of a group of zombies stumbling down the road, unaware of the survivors' presence. There were at least 15 of them, moving in a loose formation, their broken limbs dragging behind them. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't just the number of zombies, it was the sound of something else. A low growl echoed from the shadows, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A creature had joined the horde, something bigger, something more dangerous. A snarling, twisted figure with the body of a man, but the face of a predator. A skinwalker. The group tensed, fear gripping them. The skinwalkers were a new breed of undead, faster, more intelligent, and deadly. They could track their prey with unnerving precision, and once they locked onto you, there was no escape. "That's not good," Sarah muttered under her breath. "We need to stay out of sight." Marcus's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. "We can't stay here forever. We need a plan, and we need it now." They watched as the zombies and the skinwalker moved closer, their growls and moans filling the air. It was clear that they were searching for something, or someone. The survivors had to move, but how? "We need to get across that road," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we wait too long, they'll find us." "I can draw their attention," Ben's voice broke through the silence. He was the youngest of the group, just a boy of 18, but he had a fire in his eyes. "I can throw a rock, make them look the other way. You guys move across while they're distracted." Sarah shook her head. "No, Ben. We're not risking your life." But Ben was already moving, slipping from the shadows, his eyes fixed on the road. He grabbed a large stone from the ground and hurled it as hard as he could toward a nearby dumpster. The sound echoed in the night, and instantly, the zombies turned toward the noise, shuffling toward it with relentless hunger. The skinwalker paused, sniffing the air as if trying to detect the source of the distraction. But it was already too late. The zombies were focused on the sound, and the survivors had to act fast. "Now!" Sarah hissed. The group sprang into action, moving swiftly but silently across the open road. Their hearts raced as they ran, their legs pumping with adrenaline. They had only a few moments before the zombies realized they had been tricked. They made it halfway across when a loud, guttural roar filled the air. The skinwalker had caught their scent. "Move!" Marcus shouted. The group pushed forward, their breaths coming in sharp gasps. But the skinwalker was faster. It lunged toward them with inhuman speed, its claws slashing through the air as it targeted the nearest survivor, Ben. "Ben!" Sarah screamed as she saw the creature's clawed hand extend toward him. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a nearby piece of metal piping and swung it at the skinwalker. The blow landed with a sickening thud, but the creature didn't flinch. It barely seemed to notice the attack, its eyes locked on Ben. Marcus was right behind Sarah. He pulled his gun from its holster and fired, the loud crack of the shot echoing in the silence of the night. The bullet struck the skinwalker in the shoulder, but the creature barely slowed down. "Run!" Marcus yelled, his voice full of urgency. Ben was already ahead of them, but the skinwalker wasn't giving up that easily. It continued its pursuit, its growls filling the air. The survivors had to make it to the forest, there was no other choice. With all the strength they had left, they pushed forward, knowing that every second counted. The horde of zombies was still milling around the dumpster, unaware of the chase that was unfolding just a few yards away. But Sarah couldn't help but glance back. The skinwalker was gaining on them, and in that moment, she realized something. If they didn't find a way to stop it, none of them would survive the night. The survivors ran faster, adrenaline surging through their veins, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The forest was within reach, but the skinwalker was closing in, its unnatural speed making it nearly impossible to outrun. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each breath sharper than the last. She could feel the weight of the group's survival pressing down on her. If they didn't get away now, they wouldn't get another chance. "Keep going!" Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. He was at the rear, trying to keep the skinwalker at bay, but he knew they couldn't keep up the pace much longer. The creature was relentless, its bloodshot eyes locked onto its prey. Ben was ahead of the group, his legs moving faster than he'd ever run before. His breaths came in ragged gasps, but fear pushed him forward. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let the others down. But as the skinwalker's growl reverberated through the air, Sarah knew they were running out of time. They had to make it to the trees. "Sarah!" Ben's voice broke through the night, panic evident in his tone. He stumbled, his foot catching on a rock. For a split second, he was thrown off balance, and the skinwalker was almost upon him. Its claws glinted in the moonlight as it reached out for its prey. Without thinking, Sarah pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort. She couldn't lose him. Not now. "Ben," she shouted, her voice cracking as she reached out for him. But it was Marcus who was closest. He lunged forward, grabbing Ben by the collar of his jacket and yanking him out of the skinwalker's grasp just in time. The creature's claws scraped against Ben's jacket, but the damage was minimal. They had escaped, for now. "Move!" Marcus growled, not waiting for any more hesitation. He shoved Ben toward the trees. "We have to get to the forest, or we're dead." The skinwalker howled in frustration, its eyes burning with rage as it tried to regain its balance. But it was too late, the survivors had made it to the trees. The dense foliage offered them some cover, but it wouldn't last long. The skinwalker wasn't about to give up so easily. As they dove into the shadows of the forest, Sarah's heart still raced. She kept her eyes trained on the dark outline of the skinwalker as it stalked the edge of the tree line, its silhouette barely visible against the moonlit sky. "We need to find higher ground," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with the same anxiety they all felt. "It won't stop until it catches us. If we can get somewhere it can't reach, we might have a chance." "But where?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper as the group moved deeper into the forest. They had no idea what lay ahead, no idea where the skinwalker was leading them, or how long they could keep running. "There's a cabin up ahead," Marcus said, his hand gripping the map he had taken from the town earlier. "I scouted it out a while ago." It's abandoned, should be safe for a while. Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to see the skinwalker's eyes glinting in the distance. The creature hadn't given up on its pursuit, its low growl filling the night air. They were being hunted. "Let's go," Sarah said, determination hardening her voice. "If we don't make it to the cabin, we're sitting ducks out here." The group pushed forward, moving through the dense forest with only the faint light of the moon guiding their way. The cabin, if it was still standing, was their only hope. It was a gamble, but it was the only option they had. As they neared the cabin, Sarah saw the faint outline of the structure in the distance, a small, weathered building barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, just as Marcus had said, but that didn't mean it would be empty. "Stay alert," Marcus warned. "There could be more of them out here." The group approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Sarah's senses were on high alert, every rustling leaf, every snapping twig made her heart skip a beat. They were too close to safety to be caught now. They reached the cabin's door, and Marcus motioned for them to stop. He checked the door handle, his fingers trembling slightly. Then, with a sharp breath, he pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was dark and dusty, the air stale with neglect. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years. But as Sarah stepped inside, she immediately felt a sense of cautious relief. They were safe for the moment. "Lock the door," Marcus ordered, his voice low. "We'll hold up here until we figure out our next move." Sarah and the others moved to block the door, pushing old furniture and debris to form a barricade. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them some time. "Are we safe?" Ben asked, his voice trembling with fear. "For now," Sarah answered, her eyes scanning the cabin's dark corners. "But the skinwalker isn't going to stop. It will keep coming." The group settled into the cabin, their movements quiet and tense. They knew that the safety they'd found was temporary at best. The skinwalker had already proven how dangerous it was. If they weren't careful, it would find a way in. Hours passed in eerie silence as they took stock of their supplies and tried to rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Each sound, each creak of the cabin's old beams, sent a jolt of fear through their bodies. The skinwalker was out there, and they knew it wasn't done hunting them yet. The hours inside the cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute a ticking clock as the survivors huddled together in uneasy silence. Sarah sat near the window, her eyes constantly scanning the forest beyond. She tried to push down the gnawing fear in her gut, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The skinwalker was still out there. The undead horde, too, wasn't far behind. It was only a matter of time before they found the cabin. Ben sat on the floor, his head buried in his hands. The pressure of the situation was starting to take its toll on him. "How long are we supposed to stay here?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of their hopelessness. "Until we have a plan," Marcus replied, his voice steady but filled with the same anxiety that gripped all of them. "We need to figure out how to get to the next safe zone. Somewhere we can rest, regroup, and figure out our next move." "I don't think there's anywhere safe," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The world's changed. There's no place left to run." "We'll find something," Marcus said, more to himself than anyone else. He was trying to stay hopeful, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. The crackling of the fire in the corner was the only sound in the cabin for a while. Then, suddenly, a noise from outside caught Sarah's attention. A faint rustling, followed by a low growl. Her heart skipped a beat. The skinwalker had returned. "Quiet!" Sarah hissed, her voice sharp as she motioned for the others to stop talking. Everyone froze, listening intently. The rustling continued, but now, it was closer. Much closer. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the machete she had strapped to her side. The cold steel was a comforting weight, but she knew it wouldn't be enough if the skinwalker breached the cabin. "Stay low," Marcus whispered. He moved silently toward the door, signaling for everyone to gather in the far corner of the room. "We need to figure out if it's the skinwalker or just another zombie." The door rattled slightly, and Sarah's heart pounded. They were all so close to the edge now, just one mistake could lead to everything falling apart. Ben's eyes were wide, his body tense with fear. What if it gets in? What do we do then? We fight, Marcus said, his voice firm. And we don't stop fighting until we have no other choice. The rustling stopped for a moment, and in the unnatural stillness, Sarah heard the soft shuffle of feet, zombie feet. She held her breath, waiting. They had been lucky so far, but luck didn't last forever. Then, a loud thud echoed from the cabin door. Something, or someone, had bumped into it. The group tensed, moving into position as silently as possible. Another thud. Is it trying to break in? Ben whispered, his eyes wide. I think it's testing the door, Sarah whispered back. Waiting to see if we'll make a sound. We need to stay completely silent. They all nodded in agreement, the tension thick in the air. The thudding continued, each strike louder than the last. Something was out there, circling, pacing, trying to find a way in. Should we leave the cabin? Ben asked nervously, his hand gripping the edge of a chair. No, Marcus said quickly. If we leave now, we'll only be putting ourselves in more danger. It's better to wait until morning. We'll stay hidden and plan our next move. They huddled together in the corner, the cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. Sarah couldn't stop her mind from racing. They had survived this long, but for how much longer? The skinwalker, the zombies, the endless threats, they were all closing in. She could feel the walls closing around her, the suffocating reality of their situation. Then, another sound, something different, caught her attention. A faint tapping. As if someone, or something, was knocking on the window. Sarah turned to face the others. Did anyone hear that? She whispered urgently. Marcus's eyes widened in alarm. It's not the skinwalker. It's someone else. He moved to the window cautiously, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. The tapping came again, louder now, more frantic. Whoever, or whatever, was outside seemed desperate to get in. They couldn't afford to take any chances. They had to make sure they knew who or what was out there before they opened the door. Stay here, Marcus ordered quietly, his voice firm. He moved toward the window, peering out carefully, but his breath caught as he caught sight of the figure outside. It wasn't the skinwalker, nor was it one of the zombies. It was a person, alive. Someone's out there, Marcus whispered, his hand tightening around his weapon. But they could be trying to lure us out. Don't trust anyone. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Who could it be? And why hadn't they been seen before? Maybe it's another survivor, Sarah suggested, her voice tinged with hope, but she quickly tempered it with caution. But we can't afford to let our guard down. If it's a trap, we'll deal with it, Marcus said, his eyes cold with resolve. Let's get to the door. We're opening it. Slowly. If it's a trap, we'll be ready. Sarah nodded, her mind racing as she prepared herself for whatever was out there. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this person had information. Maybe they knew a place where the survivors could be safe. But as Marcus reached for the door, Sarah's gut twisted. Hope was a dangerous thing in this world, and it was all too easy to be betrayed. The group stood frozen, their eyes glued to the door as Marcus slowly inched it open. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was deafening. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as her mind raced. Who was out there? Was it a survivor like them, or a trap set by the skinwalker, or worse, a group of zombies? Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Opening the door could either lead to their salvation or their downfall. Are we really doing this? Ben whispered, his voice tight with fear. We don't know if we can trust whoever's out there. Stay calm, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. We have no choice. We can't stay holed up here forever. Marcus nodded, his face grim but determined. On three, he muttered. 1, 2, 3. With a swift motion, he pushed the door open just enough to peer outside. The moonlight bathed the area in an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the ground. But there was no sign of any immediate threat. Just the rustling of the trees and the occasional distant growl of the undead. Then, a figure stepped into view. It was a woman, ragged and exhausted, her clothes torn and stained with dirt. Her eyes were wide, and her face pale, as though she hadn't seen sunlight in days. She stood at the edge of the cabin, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not one of them," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "Please, let me in." The survivors exchanged wary glances. The woman didn't appear to be infected, but they'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving in the new world they lived in. "We don't have much to offer," Marcus said cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on her. "Why should we trust you?" The woman's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of their distrust had struck her deep. "I understand why you're hesitant. I'm not here to hurt you. I've been running for days. The zombies, they're everywhere. And the skinwalker, it's hunting me." The name of the creature sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She remembered the terror she'd felt when it had first attacked them, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The thought of the creature hunting them, now with an unknown ally, was chilling. "I'm alone," the woman continued. "I don't know where else to go. Please. I'll leave if you want me to, but I can't survive out there much longer. I know you're just trying to survive, like me. Please let me in." For a moment, the survivors were silent, weighing their options. Trusting another person in this new world was dangerous, especially when they could easily turn on you. But the woman's desperation rang true. And in this broken world, it wasn't uncommon to find people who had been pushed to their limits, just trying to survive. Marcus's grip on the rifle loosened slightly, but he didn't lower it. He had to be sure. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone guarded. "Carla," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not looking for trouble. I just need shelter." The silence stretched, and Sarah could see Marcus's internal struggle. She could feel the tension building, every second that passed could mean disaster. But they couldn't keep hiding forever. The skinwalker would eventually find them. The zombies were relentless. And there was no guarantee they would survive without help. "Do you have any weapons?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. She couldn't risk them being caught off guard again. Carla shook her head. "I lost everything when I was running. I only have what I'm wearing." It was the truth, Sarah could see it in her eyes. She'd been through hell, just like them. Marcus let out a long breath, then nodded. "All right. You can come in. But if you try anything—" "I won't," Carla interrupted quickly. "I just want to survive." He hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped aside, opening the door fully to let her in. The survivors moved back, making space for her to enter. Carla stepped over the threshold, her eyes darting around the dark cabin as she took in her new surroundings. As she passed them, she gave each person a brief, searching look, as though assessing whether they could be trusted. When her gaze met Sarah's, there was a brief flicker of understanding. Both of them had been through too much to let their guard down easily. Once Carla was inside, Marcus closed the door behind her, securing it with the makeshift barricade they had built. They all gathered in the center of the room, the tension still hanging in the air. "Now that you're here, what's your plan?" Marcus asked, his voice still wary. "Where were you headed?" Carla took a deep breath and lowered herself onto the floor, visibly exhausted. "I don't have a plan. I was trying to get to the mountains, but the roads are too dangerous. The skinwalker, the zombies, they're everywhere. I thought maybe there'd be a chance if I could make it to a safe zone, but I lost my way. And now, well, I'm here." "You've been to the mountains?" Ben asked, his interest piqued. "What's up there?" "I don't know for sure," Carla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there are rumors, survivors. Maybe a stronghold. Maybe people still fighting. I don't know, but I have to try. I can't stay here." The mention of survivors, of a potential safe haven, lit a spark of hope in Sarah's chest. A place where they could rest, heal, and regroup. But it also raised a new set of questions. If this place existed, why hadn't they heard about it before? And more importantly, how would they get there without falling into the traps set by the undead or the skinwalker? "We'll figure it out in the morning," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We need to rest. But we'll talk more when the sun comes up." The cabin fell silent once more, the weight of the night pressing down on them. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the moment, they had a new ally. And maybe, just maybe, that was the hope they needed to keep fighting. The early morning light filtered weakly through the cracks in the cabin's walls, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The survivors had barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent their nerves on edge. The constant threat of zombies, the skinwalker, and now the uncertainty of Carla's presence gnawed at them, but they knew that waiting wasn't an option. The night had passed uneventfully, but the tension still lingered, thick and heavy, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Sarah stretched, feeling the stiffness in her muscles, a reminder of how little time they had to rest. Despite their exhaustion, they all knew they had to keep moving. Carla, who had curled up by the fire, was already awake. She hadn't slept much either, her eyes red from lack of rest, her expression haunted by something that the others could only guess at. But there was one thing that was clear: she was eager to move on. The mountains, the so-called safe zone, called to her like a distant beacon of hope. Marcus was the first to speak as he surveyed the group, his voice low but firm. "We need to leave as soon as possible. We can't stay here any longer than we have to." "I agree," Sarah replied, her gaze sweeping the room. "The longer we stay, the more dangerous it gets. The skinwalker could be back any minute, and we can't risk it. We have to move." Ben looked out the window, his face tense with unease. "How do we know if this safe zone even exists? What if it's just a story, another false hope like everything else we've heard?" Carla's eyes darkened at the doubt in Ben's voice, but she didn't react angrily. Instead, she sighed, as if the weight of her own uncertainties were too much to bear. "I've heard rumors," she said quietly, her voice distant. "But you're right. I don't know for sure. All I know is that if we don't try, we might as well give up now." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the knowledge that they were in the same boat. There was no clear answer, no guarantee of safety, only the desperate hope that they could reach something better. Marcus finally broke the silence, his expression hardening with resolve. "We'll head toward the mountains. It's our best chance, and we're not going to let fear stop us. If it's a trap, we'll deal with it. But if it's real, we could find the safety we need." "How long will it take to get there?" Ben asked, still unconvinced. Carla hesitated, then answered, "If we stay off the main roads, avoid the zombies as much as possible, maybe a few days. But it's hard to say. The landscape's changed a lot. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Sarah looked at the others, her gaze lingering on Marcus. She saw the same determination in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. They didn't have the luxury of time. The threat of the undead, and the skinwalker, was too great. They had to take a chance, even if it felt like a gamble. "All right," Sarah said. "We move out in an hour. We need to gather our supplies, double-check the gear, and make sure we're ready. No one can afford to slack off." The survivors nodded in agreement, each of them heading toward different corners of the cabin to prepare for the journey ahead. The fire had long since burned out, leaving the room in cold, muted shadows. They didn't have the time or energy for small talk, every moment was precious now. Ben packed his rucksack quickly, stuffing in what little food they had left. Sarah followed suit, checking her machete and rifle, ensuring that everything was in working order. The tension in the room was palpable as they worked in near silence, only the occasional sound of something shifting or a zipper being pulled filling the quiet. Carla moved slowly, still looking worn from days of running, but her movements were purposeful. She had no time to rest, no time to mourn the things she had lost. Like the others, she had learned long ago that survival came first, and everything else was secondary. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his voice low as he approached Sarah. He glanced over at Carla. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Carla nodded, though her face was pale, her eyes tired. "I'm not going back out there alone. I can make it." Sarah studied her for a moment, then nodded. They had no choice but to trust her, for now. The group moved to the door, the air outside still cold but fresher than inside the cabin. The sun was barely rising, and the world beyond the cabin was still mostly dark. They'd have to move quickly, take the back trails, and avoid the main roads to avoid running into any undead or other dangers. As Marcus led the way, Sarah's heart beat faster. The woods around them seemed impossibly still, as if waiting for something to happen. Every step they took felt like they were crossing an invisible line, a point of no return. Minutes passed, then hours. The landscape around them seemed to change with each step, the trees growing denser, the ground rougher. They had to be careful where they stepped, as the last thing they needed was to alert any nearby zombies to their presence. "Keep your heads down," Marcus muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close and move fast. Don't let anything distract you." They had been walking for hours when they finally reached the edge of a small clearing. The air was still and silent, but then, a distant noise broke the quiet. A low growl. A warning shot rang out in Sarah's mind. Zombies. They weren't alone. "Get down," Marcus hissed. The group dove for cover behind a thick cluster of trees, crouching low to the ground as they waited, hearts pounding. Through the trees, Sarah saw movement. Shadows. Figures. Zombies, drawn by the sound of their footsteps. "Move," Marcus commanded. The air was thick with tension as Marcus motioned for the group to stay low. Every instinct told them to move, to run, but the zombies were too close. They could hear the guttural growls and the dragging of feet through the underbrush. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her hand gripping the machete at her side, ready for the inevitable. They'd been walking for hours through the dense forest, but now they had nowhere to go but forward. The zombies were only a few yards away, their scent carried by the wind, their groans echoing in the stillness. Marcus's voice was a mere whisper, cutting through the heavy silence. "Wait for my signal. Don't move unless I say so." The group nodded, instinctively drawing closer to the trees as the growls grew louder, closer. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. The undead were on the move, their minds driven by instinct, their bodies twisted and deformed from years of decay. Ben's hand tightened on his rifle, his knuckles white. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "How many are there?" he whispered, though the question seemed almost pointless. The number didn't matter. The zombies could be anywhere, and their presence was enough to bring the group to a standstill. "Stay calm," Sarah whispered back, her heart pounding in her chest. "We'll find a way out." The growls grew louder still. The zombies were closing in, their movements slower but relentless. They would keep coming, no matter how much noise they made, no matter how many obstacles were in their way. They had to move soon, or they'd be surrounded. "Now!" Marcus hissed, snapping the group out of their frozen state. In an instant, they surged from their hiding spots, sprinting as quietly as they could through the trees, their feet crashing against the underbrush. Every branch seemed to scream in protest as they passed, every leaf crunching underfoot like a gunshot in the dead of night. The zombies weren't far behind, their growls and footsteps heavy as they followed in pursuit. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. Her eyes darted ahead, searching for the next place to hide. The trees ahead thinned, revealing a narrow path that led toward a steep hill. They had to get there, had to put distance between them and the zombies before they were overrun. "Move faster," Marcus barked, his voice urgent. The group pushed forward, desperate, determined. Sarah could hear the shuffling of feet behind them, the undead weren't far off. The sounds grew louder, the growls mingling with the sound of their breath, making it feel like they were being hunted by something far larger than just a few zombies. As they reached the edge of the path, Sarah's foot slipped, sending her sprawling forward, her hand catching the ground just in time to stop her fall. Panic surged through her as she glanced behind her to see a shadow coming fast, a figure stumbling toward her with an eerie, guttural noise. A zombie. Before she could react, Ben was there, pulling her to her feet and shoving her forward. "Keep moving," he shouted. The group was almost at the top of the hill when Carla, who had been lagging behind, let out a strangled cry. Sarah spun around just in time to see Carla caught by one of the zombies, her legs grabbed by its decaying hands. "No!" Carla screamed, her face twisted in terror. Without thinking, Sarah rushed back, her machete held high, ready to strike. She didn't have time to think about the danger, didn't have time to hesitate. Carla was one of them now, a part of their group, and she wasn't about to leave her behind. Sarah swung her machete at the zombie's arm, cutting it off with a sickening thud. The zombie recoiled, but it didn't stop, it lunged for Carla again. "Get back!" Sarah shouted as she swung the machete once more, this time severing the zombie's head. The creature crumpled to the ground, its body falling lifeless. Breathing heavily, Sarah turned to Carla, who was gasping, her face pale with fear. She was shaking, but she wasn't hurt. "Not yet." "Let's go," Sarah said urgently, grabbing Carla by the arm and pulling her toward the hill. The group reached the top of the incline, panting and exhausted. They didn't stop, though, not for a second. The threat was still there, looming just behind them, and there was no time to waste. The zombies were still coming, their footsteps heavy, their growls louder than ever. As they descended the other side of the hill, the forest thickened again. The path narrowed, forcing them into single file as they moved through the dense trees. Every few minutes, Sarah glanced over her shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Her muscles ached, her legs burned, but she kept going, kept pushing herself because there was no other choice. She had to survive. The group pressed on through the night, their progress slow but steady. They didn't speak much, each of them focused on the task ahead, getting as far away from the undead as possible. Hours passed, and the sounds of pursuit eventually faded into the distance, but the tension remained. They had evaded the immediate danger, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the zombies were back on their trail. "How much farther?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "Not much," Marcus replied. "We need to find a place to rest soon." The thought of stopping for even a moment felt like a luxury none of them could afford. But Sarah understood, they needed to regroup, to catch their breath. They couldn't keep going like this forever. As they continued through the night, they reached a small clearing, a shallow ravine hidden among the trees. It was the perfect place to hide for a while. They could rest, reassess, and plan their next move. "We'll rest here," Marcus said. "Keep watch, and we'll be up before dawn." As the group huddled together in the ravine, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. They had survived, for now. But she knew that the hardest part was still ahead of them. The skinwalker, the zombies, they were still out there, waiting for the group to make one wrong move. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it. The ravine provided them with some temporary relief, the thick walls of stone offering protection from prying eyes and the distant growls of the undead. Sarah sat against the rock face, pulling her knees close to her chest as the others took turns keeping watch. The fire they managed to build crackled softly, casting faint light around their small, makeshift camp. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But Sarah couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. The shadows seemed to creep just a little too closely, and the sounds of the forest felt muffled, as if something were lurking just beyond the trees. "How long do we stay here?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse, his eyes scanning the dark edges of the clearing. "We stay until we've caught our breath," Marcus replied, his tone firm but weary. "But we can't stay too long. The zombies will regroup. It's only a matter of time before they catch wind of us again." Ben nodded, his hand resting on his rifle. "And what about the skinwalker?" Sarah shivered at the mention of the creature. They hadn't spoken about it much since their narrow escape, but the memory of its chilling eyes and its unnatural abilities still haunted her. She wasn't sure whether to believe it was real, but the others seemed to have no doubt. Whatever it was deadly. "We'll deal with it when we have to," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Right now, we focus on getting to the mountains. Once we're there, we'll be safer." Carla had remained silent for most of the night, her face drawn and pale. She sat near the fire, her eyes distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Sarah could see the toll that the journey was taking on her, the fear that lingered in her gaze whenever she thought about what they'd left behind. But there was no time for rest or reflection. They had to keep moving. "Carla," Sarah said gently, pulling her from her thoughts. "You okay?" Carla looked up, startled for a moment, then nodded, though the effort seemed strained. "Yeah, just tired," she muttered. "I thought this would be easier. I thought we'd have more time before things got this bad." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But we're here now. And we're not giving up." "Not yet." Carla smiled weakly, but there was little strength behind it. "I'm not giving up. I just don't know how much more I can take." Sarah felt a pang of empathy for the woman. They were all feeling it, each of them carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, each haunted by the fear of what they might face next. But they had to keep pushing. They had to survive. As the night wore on, the group fell into an uneasy silence. They took turns keeping watch, and every sound from the woods outside made them jump, their hearts racing as they waited for something, anything, that would signal danger. At first light, Marcus stood up and stretched, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the distant peaks of the mountains. "All right," he said. "Time to move. We've lost enough time already." The group stood, packing up their meager supplies and preparing to leave their temporary hideout. They were all tired, physically and mentally drained from the journey, but they had no choice. There was no room for weakness. Not in a world like this. The journey ahead was not going to be easy. The landscape had become increasingly treacherous, the terrain rougher, and the zombies' presence more pronounced. They couldn't afford to get complacent. Every step they took brought them closer to the mountains, but it also brought them closer to the dangers that lay in wait. They had only traveled a few miles before the first sign of trouble appeared. The group had moved cautiously through a dense thicket of trees when Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She motioned for the others to stop. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, were several zombies. They were slowly wandering through the woods, their movements erratic, as though they were hunting for something, or someone. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Get down," Marcus whispered. "Stay quiet. We don't want them to hear us." The group crouched low, blending into the underbrush, as the zombies drew nearer. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Every muscle in her body was screaming for her to run, to move, but she knew it wasn't an option. If they moved, they would draw attention, and that would be the end of them. They waited in silence, the minutes stretching out like hours. The undead shuffled past, their grotesque faces twisted in eternal hunger, their bodies decayed but still determined. It was a reminder of how far the world had fallen, a world where the living had to be just as relentless to survive. When the last of the zombies passed, Marcus signaled for them to move. They quickly picked their way through the trees, heading in the opposite direction, their nerves on edge. The encounter had been close, too close. They had to be more careful from now on. "How much farther?" Ben asked again, his voice tight with apprehension. "Not much," Marcus answered, though the uncertainty in his voice was impossible to ignore. "We'll make it. We just have to keep going." The group pressed on, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. The mountains were close now, but they weren't the only thing the survivors had to worry about. There was something far worse waiting for them, something more dangerous than the zombies, more deadly than any creature they had yet encountered. The Skinwalker. It could be watching them right now, waiting for them to make a mistake. And when it struck, there would be no warning, no time to prepare. All they could do was keep moving, keep surviving, until they reached the mountains and the possibility of safety. The air had turned colder as the group moved deeper into the mountain range. The trees had thinned out, and the rocky terrain became more treacherous with each step they took. The distant sound of rushing water echoed through the valley, but there was no time to enjoy the peaceful sounds of nature. Their journey was far from over, and danger still lurked at every corner. As they ascended, Sarah found herself glancing over her shoulder more frequently, the unease growing with every step. The zombies were no longer their primary concern, not anymore. It was the skinwalker that haunted her thoughts, its otherworldly presence constantly on her mind. They had avoided it so far, but how long could their luck hold? How much farther? Ben asked, his voice strained from the exhaustion of climbing. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his rifle held tightly against his chest. We've been moving for hours. We're close, Marcus said, his voice flat. I can feel it. We just need to keep going. Sarah couldn't help but feel a knot in her stomach at Marcus's words. They had reached the edge of the forest, and now they were climbing the rocks that led up toward the mountain pass. It wasn't a smooth path, and every step felt like a battle, especially when the terrain shifted underfoot. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Carla, still visibly shaken from the previous encounters, stumbled as she tried to keep up. Sarah quickly moved to her side, steadying her. You okay? Sarah asked, her voice soft. Carla nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. Just tired. And scared. I don't know how much more of this I can take. You're doing great, Sarah reassured her. We're almost there. Just hang on a little longer. Carla gave a weak smile but didn't speak again. The group continued to climb, the wind picking up as they neared the higher reaches of the mountain. The path was becoming narrower, the rocks sharper, and the air thinner. Sarah could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on her, but she kept moving forward. There was no other choice. As they neared a small plateau, Marcus signaled for the group to stop. He was looking ahead, scanning the rocky outcrop for any signs of danger. Rest here for a moment, Marcus said, his voice low. We're close to the summit. We'll make it there before nightfall. The group sank onto the rocks, grateful for a brief pause. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains. The air was growing colder, but they were too close to stop now. As Sarah sat there, the tension seemed to settle over the group like a heavy blanket. They were safe, at least for the moment. But Sarah knew that the sense of safety wouldn't last. Not when they were so close to the skinwalker's domain. I don't like this, Ben muttered, his voice a low growl. It's too quiet. Too peaceful. That's what worries me, Marcus replied. The skinwalker is here, somewhere. It's waiting for us to make a mistake. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. The group remained silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the sound of their breathing the only noise breaking the stillness. Sarah's mind raced. How could they protect themselves from a creature that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves? The skinwalker could take any form, use any trick to deceive them, to get close. They had to be on guard. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, low, distant, and almost inaudible. It was a growl, like a predator's warning, but it didn't come from the direction they had expected. It came from behind them. Before anyone could react, there was a rustling sound, followed by a sharp, guttural scream. A figure moved quickly through the trees at the edge of the plateau. It was tall, too tall for a man, its body twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, like it was made of something more than flesh and bone. The skinwalker. Run! Marcus shouted, his voice breaking the calm like a lightning strike. Go now! Without hesitation, the group scrambled to their feet, adrenaline flooding their bodies as they sprinted toward the narrow pass that would lead them higher into the mountains. Sarah's heart raced as she pushed herself harder, ignoring the sting of the cold air against her lungs, the pain in her legs. They had to get away from the creature. They couldn't let it catch them. The skinwalker's growls echoed behind them, and Sarah didn't dare to look back. She could hear its footfalls, unnatural and heavy, like something that didn't belong in this world. It was closing in. She could feel it. "Keep moving." Marcus's voice rang out again. "We can't outrun it forever. We need to find shelter." They reached the narrow pass, a jagged gap in the mountain that was just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Sarah pushed herself through first, her body scraping against the sharp rock walls. Behind her, she heard Carla's frantic breathing, followed by Ben's and then Marcus. They were all in this together, trapped in this nightmare, but they couldn't afford to slow down. As they reached the other side of the pass, Sarah turned to look behind them, breathless. For a moment, there was silence. The skinwalker's growls had faded, but the sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. "We're safe, for now," Marcus panted, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "But it's only a matter of time before it finds us again." The group was exhausted, but they didn't have time to rest. They had to keep moving, because the skinwalker was still out there. And this time, it wouldn't let them escape so easily. Part 9 ends with the group being pursued by the skinwalker through the mountains. They are close to safety but realize that their troubles are far from over. With the skinwalker hot on their heels, they must push forward, knowing that survival will depend on how quickly they can adapt to the growing threat. Let me know if you'd like to continue. The wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying with it the eerie sounds of distant growls. The group pressed on, their steps hurried but measured, each one mindful of the treacherous terrain. The skinwalker was still out there, and they could feel its presence, lingering in the shadows like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts, her chest tight with exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but there was no time. The creature was relentless, and they couldn't afford to stop moving, not even for a moment. "How much farther to the summit?" Ben asked, his voice strained from the climb. He glanced back, his eyes wide with fear. "Not far," Marcus replied, his voice terse. "We just have to keep going. The summit's within reach, but we need to find shelter, somewhere we can hold up for the night." "Hold up?" Carla's voice trembled. "Are you saying we're just going to wait for it to catch up to us?" "We can't outrun it forever," Marcus said grimly. "We have to make a stand. If we get to the summit, we'll have the high ground. It'll give us an advantage." Sarah clenched her fists, the reality of their situation sinking in. The mountains were their last hope, but the skinwalker was relentless. It wouldn't give up. She knew that, deep down. And the closer they got to the summit, the more dangerous the climb became. The rocks were slick with ice, and the wind seemed to push against them, urging them to slow down, to give up. But giving up wasn't an option. Not when they were this close. They reached a narrow ledge, a precarious path that led upward toward the summit. The wind howled louder here, the air thin and biting. Sarah stumbled, her foot slipping on a loose rock, but she caught herself before she fell. Behind her, Ben's voice came, low and urgent. "Hurry up. It's getting closer." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She pressed forward, her hands gripping the jagged rocks as she pulled herself up the ledge. The summit was close, so close, but every part of her screamed that they weren't alone. The skinwalker was out there, somewhere just beyond their sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They reached the top of the ledge and scrambled onto a flat, rocky surface. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it was the best they could do. Marcus immediately began scanning the area, his eyes sharp as he looked for anything that might offer them some protection. "Over there," Marcus said, pointing toward a series of jagged rocks that formed a natural barrier. "We can use those for cover." The group moved quickly, taking refuge behind the rocks, their bodies pressed against the cold stone. The air was so thin now that Sarah's head swam, her vision blurring at the edges, but she didn't dare rest. Not yet. From their new vantage point, they could see the winding path they had just ascended, the shadows growing longer as the day began to fade into evening. It was the perfect time for the skinwalker to attack, when they were tired, when their guard was down. "Stay low, stay quiet," Marcus whispered. "We can't let it find us." They huddled together behind the rocks, their eyes scanning the mountain pass below. The creature could move swiftly, its elongated limbs allowing it to scale the rocks with terrifying agility. Sarah's heart raced as she imagined it slipping past their defenses, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Hours passed in tense silence, the night deepening around them. Every movement in the distance sent a jolt of fear through Sarah's chest. The skinwalker was out there, just waiting for them to make a mistake. And all they could do was wait, clinging to the hope that the creature wouldn't find them, that they would survive the night. But then, just as the last vestiges of daylight disappeared, a figure appeared on the narrow path below. It wasn't the skinwalker. It was a man, a lone figure, moving cautiously up the mountain. "Who the hell is that?" Ben muttered, his hand tightening around his rifle. "Stay down," Marcus ordered. "It could be a trap." They watched in silence as the figure drew closer, his movements slow and deliberate. As he reached the flat part of the path below, he stopped, his head swiveling as if he were searching for something. The man's face was obscured by a hood, but the faint light from the dying sun illuminated his silhouette. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure turned and began to climb down the path. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, his body swaying unnaturally as he descended. "It's him," Sarah whispered, her blood running cold. The skinwalker. It had found them. Marcus didn't hesitate. He stood, pulling his rifle from his back and aiming it at the descending figure. "Everyone stay behind me. We fight if we have to." The skinwalker stopped at the base of the ledge and tilted its head toward them, its glowing eyes fixated on the group. It was impossible to read its expression, but Sarah could feel the malice radiating from it. And then, with an unholy screech, the skinwalker lunged. Everything happened in an instant. The creature's long, twisted limbs reached toward them, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque, unnatural grin. Ben fired first, the shot ringing out through the mountainside, but it was only a distraction. The skinwalker was too fast. It barreled toward them with the speed of a predator, its claws reaching for Carla. But Marcus was quicker. He shot again, hitting the creature in the chest. It howled in pain, but it didn't stop. It continued its relentless charge. "Run!" Marcus shouted. "Get to the rocks!" The group scattered, running for cover, but the skinwalker was upon them. It was fast, but they were desperate. For the first time in their journey, they fought back, together. The battle for survival had reached its final, deadly stage. Part 10 concludes with the skinwalker's attack, the group's final stand against the relentless creature. With nowhere left to run, they are forced to face their enemy head-on, the outcome uncertain. The tension is high, and the battle will determine who will survive this nightmare. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments.